Chapter 10, Genesis chapter 25 through 35. Jacob is Israel, literally this time. This part of Genesis begins with the birth of not one son, but two. Isaac begets Jacob and Esau. A hopefully useful side note: in the Bible, men beget children while women bear them. From their birth, we are told that both of these sons are destined to be nations. Jacob's descendants will become Israel, and Esau's will be Edom, Israel's sometimes contentious neighbor to the southeast. It doesn't take a lot of effort to see that Jacob will be the focus of the story. As it turns out, Jacob is also a liar, and so is his mom, Rebekah. There is nothing to be gained from trying to make excuses for either of them. And it's not like Jacob's father and grandfather were models of virtue, either, as they passed off their wives as sisters in order to save their own necks. Reading these stories for the moral virtues of the main characters, like one might read a fable, is a misreading. Sibling rivalry. As their descendants will be after them, brothers Jacob and Esau are in conflict with each other. This is not the first time in Genesis that brothers have had trouble getting along, and it will not be the last. The Cain and Abel story already hints at the conflict we are about to read here. Running throughout Genesis and the entire Old Testament is the theme of God preferring the younger brother to the elder, allowing the younger to leapfrog over the older and receive his honor. We can see this in Cain's story. When Abel dies, Cain's other younger brother Seth takes place of first importance. We can see this when God chooses Isaac over Ishmael. We see it a bit later in Genesis in the story of Joseph, and elsewhere in pivotal moments in the Old Testament. Moses was the chosen deliverer, though younger than his brother Aaron. David was crowned king of Israel, though the youngest of 8 brothers. David was succeeded by Solomon, although Adonijah was older. And we see this same theme in the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau are fraternal twins who seem destined for conflict from birth. Jacob, the second-born, is grasping Esau's heel as he comes out. As they grow up, Jacob is described as a peaceful homebody, while Esau is a not-too-bright, hairy hunter. Esau is Hebrew for hairy. After hunting one day, Esau comes home famished and asks Jacob for some of that red stew he was making. Instead of either being a gracious brother or simply telling him to get lost, Jacob uses the request as an opportunity to take advantage of his elder brother's hunger. He reveals his desire to be top dog in the family by striking a deal with Esau. He offers some stew in exchange for Esau's birthright, meaning Esau's rights as firstborn. Esau agrees, perhaps thinking the agreement means nothing or that he can get out of it. Or perhaps he's just incredibly stupid. And it seems no one bothers to tell Isaac of this little switcheroo at the stew. Why bother the old man, right? This sets up another confrontation at the end of Isaac's life when Jacob and Esau are a little older. At this point, Isaac is pretty much blind and apparently senile. He calls for Esau, wanting to give him the firstborn blessing before he dies. But first, Esau is told to go out, hunt some game, and prepare for his father a tasty meal. Instead of replying, "Yeah, Dad, about that. I sort of sold my birthright to Jacob a while back for some lunch." Esau goes out, perhaps hoping he can sneak in the blessing without Jacob knowing about it. That is, Esau has every intention of breaking the oath he swore to Jacob. Rebekah overhears this and thinks fast. Rather than putting on the brakes and having a family meeting, she tells Jacob what his rat brother is doing. They devise a plan which does not involve coming clean and telling the truth. Of course not. Why do that? Instead, Jacob dresses up like Esau, even down to covering his arms and neck with goat skin. My Esau. What hairy and goat-like arms you have." Then Rebecca prepares a meal just as Isaac likes it, and the ruse works. They come into Isaac's presence, and he asks, "Who is it?" Jacob answers, in his best Esau voice, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Isaac is a little skeptical at first. Why does Esau sound like Jacob? But as soon as he gets a whiff of the clothes, all doubts vanish. Jacob lies to his father to secure the blessing of the firstborn, the birthright he manipulated out of the hands of his oafish elder brother. Sounds like a job for a family systems therapist with a clear calendar. And have we mentioned that Jacob is the immediate progenitor of the nation of Israel? Like in a made-for-TV movie, Esau comes back right after this little ruse, not suspecting a thing. When he finds out, he is livid about not getting his blessing, and Isaac is livid for having the goat skin pulled over his already blind eyes. Apparently, however, the rules of trick your father into giving you a blessing are clear. The blessing can't be undone. The only blessing Isaac has left for Esau is no blessing at all. He will live by the sword and serve his younger brother, though he will at some point break loose in Genesis chapter 27, verses 39 and 40. That's the best Isaac can do for his firstborn. Sounds more like a curse, but more importantly for us, we see here yet another preview of things to come. This back and forth between two brothers is actually a description of the problems between two nations. Edom and Israel have a tense relationship, though much of it is marked by Edom's subjugation to Israel. During the reign of Jehoram of Judah, Edom revolted against the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own in 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 20. Isaac's so-called blessing to Esau foreshadows a later political reality, as we have seen elsewhere already. Back to the story itself. Jacob deceives his father and his brother, even though the birthright was technically his by nature of the studio. Whatever. Esau feels cheated and makes it clear that the little brother is a dead man after Isaac dies. So, to protect her boy, Rebecca lies to Isaac again, or at least half lies, by saying that she wants Jacob to go to Haran, where her brother Laban lives, to find a wife, rather than having to choose one of these Hittite women hanging around. Isaac summons Jacob without mentioning the whole "I am Esau" thing and tells him to go. And Jacob is only too happy to escape his brother's vengeance. And while Jacob is hiding out from his brother and trying to find a wife, Esau is back home throwing a rebellious pity party. He marries, of all people, a Canaanite woman, thus directly disobeying his father. And can you really blame him? So, Jacob's journey begins. He flees from the anger of his hairy and scary brother and takes refuge with Uncle Laban. On the way, he stops for a night at a place that will soon get the name Bethel, which is made up of two Hebrew words, Beth and El, meaning house of God. How did it get that name? That's what the story is designed to tell us. With a stone for a pillow, Jacob falls asleep and has a dream of a ladder going up to the sky with angels going up and down, sort of a portal between heaven and earth. There at the top is Yahweh. We might expect God to reprimand Jacob for being a little liar. Instead, Yahweh reiterates his promise to Abraham. Jacob's offspring will be uncountable and a blessing to all peoples of the earth. Biblical scholars typically understand the ladder to heaven story as serving two purposes. One purpose is to emphasize that God has chosen Jacob, the ladder's lies and deceitfulness notwithstanding, to be the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Given Israel's less than stellar history later on, an ancestor like Jacob, who still meets with God's approval despite his shortcomings, would be most reassuring. Jacob, like every one of his ancestors, is a flawed hero. Screwing up is deep in Israel's genes. God carrying them along regardless is deeper still. A second purpose of the story is to explain how this prominent city came to be called House of God when its older name was Luz. In addition to Genesis chapter 29, verse 18, see also Judges chapter 1, verse 23. Jacob has marital problems, and he deserves every bit of it. Jacob continues his journey and meets his future wife Rachel by a well. She is Laban's youngest daughter of two. Jacob is smitten with passion, and Laban promises to let him marry her in return for 7 years of work. What's 7 years hard labor compared to getting to marry your cousin? Jacob gladly agrees, and the time flies. And on his wedding night, his bride is brought to his tent for usual wedding night stuff. In the morning, he is greeted not by Rachel, but by her elder and less attractive sister, Leah. Maybe Jacob had too much of the wedding wine, or perhaps, as poetic justice, he inherited the blindness of his father Isaac. The trickster got tricked. He should have known Laban was up to no good. It wasn't customary to marry off the younger daughter without getting rid of the older one first. But he didn't see that coming, so now he is stuck with Leah. At any rate, Jacob gets a dose of his own medicine. He had earlier used Esau's urges to manipulate him out of his right as firstborn. Driven by his own urges, Jacob is now tricked into giving the elder sibling what she deserved. Payback for what he did to Esau. But at least Laban offers him another deal. Jacob can work another 7 years and get Rachel too, and he does. Soon the story focuses on another sibling rivalry. Which sister can have more children for Jacob? Leah is quite fertile, while Rachel is barren, as was Sarah. So Jacob winds up begetting 7 children by Leah, 6 boys, 1 girl. Rachel gets jealous of all the babies Leah is having and gives her slave Bilhah to Jacob so that he can have children through her. As with Sarah and Hagar, the slave bears him 2 boys. At this point, Leah's proverbial well seems to have run dry, so she gives Jacob her slave Zilpah, who bears him 2 more boys. Then Rachel finally has a son of her own, Joseph, who will become a central figure in a few chapters. Later, she will die giving birth to her second child and another important figure, Benjamin. What a mess! From the beginning, Jacob's story, with all its shady characters, plays like a reality show. And at the end of it all, we have 12 sons. The nation of Israel is born out of family dysfunction, which will be with them through their existence. More trickery. By now, Jacob has spent quite enough time with his shady father-in-law uncle, and he decides to leave. But Laban has experienced the fruits of the promise. He tells Jacob, "You can't go. I know that I am being blessed because of you." Sounds like God is making good on his promise that Abraham's offspring will bring blessing for the nations in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. So, Jacob agrees to stay and take care of Laban's flocks on one condition. Laban must allow Jacob to keep the speckled, spotted, and dark animals. And in a heavy dose of irony, Jacob says, "And you know you can trust me. I'm an honest man." Good one, Jacob. Now, it's Laban who falls for a trick, which seems to involve a magical mating ritual of some sort. Jacob takes fresh shoots of poplar, almond, and plane and peels them to create stripes. This episode alludes to an old theory that when animals look at striped branches when they are mating, they produce striped and spotted babies. Biblical scholars typically label this a bit of folklore, like spinning gold from straw. The point, however, is that Jacob once again profits from his deception. When Laban's sons start getting suspicious and Laban gets a bit moody toward Jacob, Jacob does what he does best. He avoids the conflict and takes off for Bethel, which is where had told Jacob to go in the Stairway to Heaven dream in chapter 28. If it were only that easy, Laban chases after him, but not for the reason we might suspect. Yes, he feels cheated by Jacob. Who doesn't at this point? But Laban's main beef is that his household idols are missing. Apparently, this is a big enough issue to motivate a chase of several hundred miles from Padan Aram to Gilead. Laban catches up to Jacob and confronts him about the gods. Jacob, not knowing that Rachel has taken them, tells Laban that whoever in his camp has the gods will not live. We need to pause here and ask, what in the world is Laban doing with household gods, and why in the world would Jacob's wife, of all people, want them around? Weren't Abraham and Isaac both careful to get wives from their families so that they would be faithful to Yahweh? These people are just a heartbeat away from the father of the 12 tribes, and they are still dabbling with other gods. True, the prohibitions against idols and such are not given until Mount Sinai in the first book of Exodus. We could excuse their behavior as ignorance. But if Israel is shaping its story as we have seen, why not leave out, or at least massage, the deceit, disbelief, and idolatry? The author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles has no problem doing this. For example, when he leaves out David's sin with Bathsheba in his telling of Israel's story. The answer, once again, is that the stories in Genesis mirror Israel's later history. The Israelites, from beginning to end, are not models of virtue or faithfulness to God. Yet how does God react to all this? God does not overlook these misdeeds as a clueless parent might allow children to run amok in a restaurant. Rather, God disciplines the people and then presses on with the plan anyway, even with a less than stellar cast of characters. God looks past the inadequacies of his people to execute his plan to bring order back into a chaotic world. God will always live up to the agreement he made with Abraham, even to a people in exile. And talk about past inadequacy. Jacob, the father of the nation of Israel, married into a family that has household idols. Mingling with foreign idols is a constant issue for Israel later on, and the ultimate reason why Israel winds up as the guests of the Babylonians for 50 years or so. That constant struggle is already reflected here in the story of Jacob. God's unwavering faithfulness is summed up in the Hebrew word chesed, which can also be interpreted as love, not an intense but fleeting emotional attachment, but more like the 60-year commitment and marriage of Ali and Noah in the Notebook. It means that God is committed, sticking to his people no matter what. Again, this is not to condone Israel's bad behavior, but to draw attention to God's character. This is the kind of God we worship, a God who is compassionate and faithful. You might even say that part of the reason Israel's story is told in this way is to draw attention away from Israel and toward God. That this story would succeed, given the track record of the characters in it, is unlikely, to put it mildly. Back to Rachel, who stole her father's idols. She is a trickster, a chip off the old block and just like her husband. While Laban is searching for the gods in Leah's tent, she takes the gods, puts them on her saddle, and sits on them. And when he comes over to her, she says politely, "I would love to get down and give you a big hug, Dad, but unfortunately it's that time of the month." Crisis averted, and Jacob and Laban agree to be at peace, provided Jacob promises never to mistreat his daughters or to take other wives. With this, Jacob's 20-year relationship with Laban comes to an end. Jacob arrived in Haran a single man. He is leaving wealthy and the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. It looks like the fortunes of a people are turning for the better. Indeed, a patriarch is born. A wrestling match and a family reunion. The inevitable reunion between Jacob and Esau is upon us. Chapter 32 opens with Jacob heading back down into Esau's territory. The messenger sends word that Esau is on his way to meet Jacob, which prompts the obvious nervous question, will this be a reunion or a battle? Oh, the messenger adds, did I mention Esau bringing 400 men with him? If Jacob was hoping for hugs and kisses, the 400 men with Esau suggest otherwise. The squirmy mama's boy, Jacob, versus the mighty and hairy hunter, plus 400 men. It's not looking good. So, Jacob, stop us if you've heard this one, tries to manipulate the situation in his favor. He prays to God to save him, and then he sends gifts to pacify Esau. That night, as his gifts are on their way to Esau, Jacob finds himself in what is surely one of the oddest and seemingly most random episodes in Genesis. He has an all-night wrestling match with a man, or at least that is what we are told at first. Jacob is apparently quite a physical stud, and the man, seeing that he is not able to subdue Jacob, disables him by touching his hip socket. Then he adds, "Let me go, it's almost daybreak." Is this mysterious figure a vampire or just tired? This episode is puzzling. A man attacks Jacob at night, can't overpower him, and yet is able to knock Jacob's hip joint out of whack with one touch. What is happening here? But Jacob appears to know this is not just a normal fight. He tells the man he will not let go unless he blesses him. The man agrees and blesses Jacob by changing his name to Israel, which means he strives with God. The very name of God's people is a window into things to come. In their very name, the Israelites make plain and public that they see themselves as a people that struggle with God. That struggle will take on many dimensions. For example, Job's struggle with God's justice. Qoheleth's struggle with God's unreliability in Ecclesiastes. The many psalmists who wonder out loud, where is God when you need him? This is not a people who see themselves as triumphant, tops on the food chain, but as a wandering people who, to use the vernacular of our day, struggle with their faith. This man becomes less human as Jacob realizes that his wrestling match has not been with a neighborhood bully shepherd, but with a divine being. Jacob renames the place Peniel, face of God, and as a perpetual reminder of this divine encounter, Jacob hereafter walks with a limp, which the author of Genesis then describes as the reason why, to this day, Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip. Like their fathers of old, the Israelites are defined by their struggle with God. And like Jacob, they intend to hold on to God so that they can be blessed. Israel is determined to stay in their struggle with God for as long as it takes. Even exile, however utterly discouraging that may be, will not dissuade them. Whatever else the story means in the flow of the narrative, it is used to prepare Jacob for his inevitable meeting with Esau. He has grown up in his struggle with God, and now he acts like a man. Before his encounter with God, he was a coward who sent gifts to pacify his angry brother. Now he courageously moves from the back to the front of his entourage and meets his brother face to face. And when he gets there, he bows before Esau 7 times, a sign of total submission known to us from other ancient cultures. We can understand this gesture even today. Imagine having offended someone and in a very public gesture, going up to them in a supermarket, street, church, whatever, and bowing to the ground 7 times. Utter self-imposed humiliation. And what does Esau do in response to this gesture? Instead of a knife to the back, he gives Jacob a genuine man hug. The brothers are reunited, and Israel is a new man. After their reunion, Jacob practically begs Esau to accept the gift of livestock that was brought to him. The Hebrew word for gift here is the same word used earlier for the blessing stolen by Jacob at the beginning of the story. So, to tie up the loose ends, in a symbolic gesture, Jacob offers back to his brother the blessing that is properly his. That is, out of the blessing he received from God, he now returns that blessing to his brother. And notice how Esau reacts. Not gimme gimme, rather, he only accepts because Jacob is insistent. These two brothers have come a long way. The very thing they quarreled over and that caused so much family dissension is now something they want the other to have in a most desperate way. Perhaps Israel is starting to behave like Israel should. The seed of the promise to Abraham is beginning to sprout. God has blessed Israel, and through him, others are being blessed. Now, an independent and rich man with nothing to fear from his brother, Israel goes on to settle near the city of Shechem, which is in Canaan. Abraham had also passed through there in chapter 12, verse 6. Israel buys a parcel of land, digs a well, a way of laying claim to the land, and builds an altar that he names El Elohe Yisrael, which means something like, Mighty is the God of Israel. Israel is beginning to take hold of Canaan, the land of promise. As we will see throughout Israel's story, the Canaanites didn't exactly hold a welcome to the neighborhood party. At the end of Israel's life, he moves from Shechem and returns to Paddan Aram, where his name had been changed. All is well. The command to be fruitful and multiply is repeated, as is the promise of Canaan as their perpetual home. God's dual promise of people and land is still a go. The story ends with a list of Israel's 12 sons and an account of the deaths of Rachel, then Isaac. And the last sentence ends on a hopeful note of reconciliation. Isaac is buried by both sons, Israel and Esau, in chapter 35, verse 29. Now we are poised to move on to the last phase of the story of Genesis.